Hi, thanks for coming to my channel. This one's going to overlap a little bit with some previous videos I've made, as is always the case, because sometimes I want to look at fresh perspectives or, something is relevant, so I feel, worth talking about more than once, perhaps from different perspectives, or sometimes what I do is I look at a generic subject that I might be talking about, and I'll look at what I said about the subject, say 2 years ago or 3 years ago, and I usually find that there is different angles to take with it. So yeah, there will be some overlap, but basically, I was going to make a video actually about Extinction Rebellion, perhaps a follow-up to the one I made a few weeks ago. A few weeks ago, yeah, I think it was about a week ago. Um, But, I think they're ego driven and I don't really want to give them attention. Um, but just from the outset, for the record, I pretty much have no respect for this movement. Not the initiative it claims to be about necessarily. Um, I'm not a climate change denier. I believe it's a major issue, and I think some of the developments this year has really shown that record temperatures. I mean, 49 degrees in British Columbia, that's clearly an issue. Um, and coming up to the COP26 summit in Glasgow in November, I think that we can't ignore this problem. The pandemic, is going to be gone at some point, but this is going to be an issue that is going on and on. I think there's a lot of areas that are still undervalued in terms of priorities. For example, plastic waste. Um, it may not kill people to the same extent as, for example, air pollution. Air pollution is, staggering death toll worldwide. There's 7 million people a year, which is a truly staggering figure. So plastic waste doesn't necessarily do that, but it does have a severe impact on ecology in the world oceans. And when I see tack from McDonald's, like they need to stop doing that, making these rubbish toys that children will look at for 1 minute and then it gets thrown away. That's an example of just plastic waste. So I think areas like that need to be looked at more. We've probably improved a little bit in this country, but it's clear there's way too much plastic still being wasted. Um, But I want to talk about basically, though there will be definitely other videos about the subject of climate change, particularly leading up to that summit. But I want to talk about protest and the right to protest and the importance of responsible protest. Because, I think that one thing that we get in free countries or relatively free countries, I don't think any society is 100% free. But in democracies where you have relative freedom, I think that protesters kind of take it for granted in the sense that they will latch onto a particular cause. And I'm not saying it's not sincere, I'm not saying they don't believe in the cause, but more often than not, you get a situation where people think that because they are pushing a particular cause, it kind of gives them a right to do as they please. And I think Extinction Rebellion is a very good example of this. Um, So they were demonstrating in London again last week. A French group apparently threw red paint over the Victoria Memorial. I don't know if that's the one in Whitehall or the one, I think there's one near Buckingham Palace. But here's the thing, every time they vandalize statues and public buildings, um, supposedly for, I mean, in the case of banks, for unethical policies as they see it, to the ecology and to developing countries. But here's the thing, and this is the irony of it. Who is going to be cleaning up that damage? Because obviously the buildings can't be left like that with these garish big marks on them. So someone needs to clean it up, probably council workers. And those council workers will be pretty mediocre salaries, probably quite low salaries. So what's interesting about that is that Extinction Rebellion, which is a predominantly middle class movement, I mean it is, There's no question about that. Okay, I'm not going to say every single person tied to Extinction Rebellion is one and the same, but I do think it tends to attract middle class, liberal lefty types. I mean, that's just pretty obvious. So they are not really living in the shoes of a council worker who has to clean up their damage. Um, they can afford to be revolutionaries. But I really think the approach to Extinction Rebellion needs to change. They don't care about spending a night in a prison cell because they see themselves as martyrs. They're very, very, very self righteous people. They're incapable of introspection. I've yet to come across an Extinction Rebellion activist who can introspect and say, well, actually, maybe our tactics are wrong. You know, they're very, very, very self assured that way. I would say arrogant that way. So, that is arresting them. I don't think it works. I think they need to be absolutely hammered with fines to the point of even making them really, really feel it. Why? Because something has to be done. Something has to be done. I mean, if we keep going this way, they're going to escalate these protests because they feel absolutely morally vindicated. They look at what's happening in the world, rising temperatures and so on, and they think, oh, well, that legitimizes the way we're doing this. Because in their argument, we need to do this, it's the only way the government will take notice. I don't agree with that, and I don't agree that without their infantile, self-aggrandizing tactics, the public wouldn't take notice. When news reports about deadly flooding in Germany, or wildfires in California or Turkey, or record heat waves in British Columbia, that's how people are informed by journalism, by news, and sometimes by direct experience. It's not, this delusion that they have that the public sees them daubing a building with red paint. Oh, well, they might have a point. We better pay attention to climate change. No, this is what they are so deluded about. The public, the vast majority of the public are against them, or at least against their tactics. But in their arrogance, Extinction Rebellion believe they're the only people that care. So they would then retort, oh, but we need to wake the public up because the rest of us are ignorant peasants. We're idiots. We don't know what's going on, so we need to be enlightened. Senior Extinction Rebellion people have literally boasted about wanting to hurt the public because we need to be woken up. So their theory is the more they disrupt public life, the more they, for example, target infrastructure, that's going to frustrate the public. The public's going to be angry and take it on the government. What they fail to understand is it's only making the public more angry with them. It's making the public, I don't want to say it, but it's making the public actually start to hate them. Because if that sounds like hyperbole, consider this. We have already faced huge restrictions with the pandemic, right? Now, I live in a small city, but I can imagine if I was a regular person in London and I had to commute to work, and season tickets are already extremely expensive in the southeast of England. Imagine you get these Extinction Rebellion protesters and block railway lines, and that then makes you late for work, and it causes this disruption over and over and over again because they show no signs of abating. Um, I think that is going to breed real resentment. It's going to cause a lot of stress, but with that stress is going to come resentment. In the extreme delusion of Extinction Rebellion, they seem to think that if we stress the public out, they'll take their anger out on the government. Well, people might be angry with the government or even angry with the police. They'll say that not enough's being done to control these anarchists. And that's what I think Extinction Rebellion are. They claim that they aren't. But if they're not, I mean, I cannot fathom how they believe that tearing up the green at Cambridge University, as they literally done, will help lower carbon emissions. That's insanity. And it says to me that this is a group that is far more interested in their own ego, getting attention for the wrong reasons, not the right reasons as they think, for the wrong reasons, than actually trying to solve the problem or at least address the problem. You know, if they were really interested in tackling this issue, There is a whole range of other effective things they can do. They can support green business. They can promote the planting of trees. They can lobby the government peacefully. But they say, oh, well, that doesn't work, so let's just vandalize a building. I mean, if they weren't hiding behind the green issue, well, it is criminality. But I think they have this idea, oh, well, we're eco warriors, so that makes us righteous. I mean, put it this way: if some drunk, um, just decide to get a spray can and vandalize a building because he or she was didn't know what they were doing, they would be labeled a yob. They would be labeled a menace to society or a nuisance. So I don't see why self-righteous protesters should be treated any differently. It's just criminality. That's all it is. That brings me to the point about peaceful protest. Extinction Rebellion activists are not violent. They're not throwing punches at people. They're not violent in that sense. But the absence of aggression, physical aggression, doesn't necessarily mean something is peaceful. Because I would argue, okay, this is my opinion, I would argue that deliberately causing stress, deliberately causing disruption, it's it's not peaceful. Vandalism isn't peaceful. Now, what they will then do is retort, oh, but what about the suffragettes? What about Gandhi? I mean, Gandhi caused civil disobedience against the British authorities, and I'm sure for colonial administrators that was very frustrating. But Gandhi Gandhi, incidentally, like a lot of great figures, he was a complex man, and he wasn't without contradictions and some questionable positions, not least on race. But anyway, as for the suffragettes, well, again, this notion that because the suffragettes, or rather an element of the suffragettes, took more extreme tactics, that suddenly got women the vote. It's a misconception. I mean, 1913, the year which was sort of the peak of suffragette activity, um, there was a range of bomb attacks at MPs' homes, in other public places, and these were not toys. These were bombs planted with nails that could have caused serious injuries or even deaths. Thankfully, they didn't. Most of the time the police managed to evacuate the premises, or in the case of MPs' homes being targeted, the MP in question wasn't at home, including Lloyd George, incidentally. Um, but if let's say that had been more successful, practically speaking, in terms of going off in a crowded area or something, they would have killed women as well. They would have maimed women as well. So actually, I think that it's far more plausible that at that time people only grew to resent them. I think what actually helped women get equal rights was determined, focused work of more moderate suffragettes. But that's it's less exciting, it's less interesting, I guess. But the fact of the matter is, a large segment of the population resented that movement when they used those sort of tactics, including, by the way, many women. So I think it's a misconception when Extinction Rebellion cite historic examples of other movements, because this notion that the suffragettes planting bombs, well, that got women the right to vote. I think that really needs to be scrutinised. Um, there are examples, there's turning points. In the case of the suffragettes, it was the death of Emily Davidson, because it was shocking. It was recorded, this suffragette threw herself in front of the king's horse. There's some uncertainty over what exactly she was trying to do, because apparently she bought a return ticket. So that might not have been a deliberate suicide. It might have been an accident, a deadly accident. But she could have killed the jockey. People forget this today. And I suppose the follow up there is they were campaigning for basic human rights. I mean, they were just campaigning for equal rights, but the tactics polarized the public at that time, just as Extinction Rebellion tactics polarize the public today. Um, I've always believed that if you want a movement to be successful, you have to get the public on side. You have to. Probably one thing that helped the women's suffrage movement was some of the brutal counter tactics. Women being beaten in Trafalgar Square, force feeding, and so on. That was pretty brutal, and it probably went against the authorities. But I am not convinced that planting bombs and vandalism got the public on side at that time. I've seen no empirical evidence that that was the case. Um, and this is what Extinction Rebellion don't seem to understand. They think if the more disruptive they are, the more the public will just be enlightened. But, again, they're arrogant. They think they're the only ones that care. Actually, many other people do care. It's just they don't see this approach as being justified or productive. I mean, in one of the more extreme stunts, they actually went to the home of David Attenborough. I mean, this is a man who's dedicated his life to the planet Earth in terms of educating people on biology, on biodiversity, and he's regularly advocated for better stewardship of the planet. So for them to hound a nonagenarian at his own home shows the depths that they're sinking to. And I really, really do believe that because this organization takes no responsibility for its own actions, because its leaders, the likes of Roger Hallam, have literally called for the overthrow of governments, I do believe that at some point you're going to find more extreme elements within Extinction Rebellion who will say, oh, well, these tactics aren't working. Vandalizing buildings isn't enough. Let's, plant bombs. If that sounds like hyperbole, it's happened before. Um, so I'm quite concerned, actually. Incidentally, when the policing bill was launched earlier this year, there was a huge outcry. Well, what about civil liberties? What about the right to protest? What about the vast majority of people to live their lives in peace? This is what was misunderstood about that bill. Its critics were saying, oh, well, this is dictatorial. Boris Johnson's behaving like a dictator. Priti Patel's behaving like a dictator. They're just trying to ban our freedom. Now, Patel, as Home Secretary, I don't agree with everything he's done. For example, I don't believe the penalty for vandalising a war memorial, despicable as that is, should be heavier than the penalty for common assault or rape. But so I don't agree with all the positions she's taken. But the fact of the matter, she was acting out of public frustration because the police had their hands tied. People were saying, why are these green anarchists being allowed to do what they want? So that needs to be understood. This idea that, the nasty Tory party just suddenly decided to ban protest, it's nonsense. I really don't think that's the case at all. Now, further down the line, if it becomes totally illegal to protest, then I'll eat my words. I will say I was wrong. I will apologize. I don't think that's the case. Because with freedom, any kind of freedom, there's responsibility. And this is what protesters seem to forget. They seem to think we're angry about this issue, so we've a right to protest, and that's our freedom, that's our right. We could do what we want. And if they are arrested for vandalism, or if they're arrested for going too far, then they shouldn't suddenly cry that their freedom's being under assault. They don't care about the freedom of the people they're disrupting. I mean, I would like to see a single productive thing Extinction Rebellion has actually done. I can't think of one. They say that they're doing this to wake up the public. But like I say, the vast majority of people, I suspect, when they say Extinction Rebellion, they don't think about climate change. They think, what a bunch of entitled anarchists. And I think it's dangerous when you have people who are so self assured that they are incapable of introspection. They're so arrogant and so self assured. That's dangerous. Because after all, if they can justify to themselves, I could do whatever I want because it's for the earth, what is to stop them then escalating? I think what will probably happen in Extinction Rebellion is there'll be splits. More moderate activists will say, no, this is going too far. Then you'll have fringe groups. There's already examples of fringe groups splitting off. They will use more extreme tactics. I really think that's plausible because the sort of targets they're looking for are very unrealistic. You know, they want us to be completely, for example, aviation free in 5 years. These sort of really, really outlandish expectations that just will not happen with the best will in the world. So because they won't get exactly what they want, I think they will escalate their techniques, and that's worrying. People might say, "Oh, they're harmless," and some of them are older people who are, they probably do the Sunday Times crossword, or they're not typical extremists in that sense. But I think that their absolutism is extreme. I think their failure to introspect is extreme. I think their self-assured arrogance is extreme. Their utter contempt for the rest of us. I think if Extinction Rebellion had their way, we'd all be living in mud huts, eating vegan food, and just basically, I mean, basically, when you strip this back, they're anti-civilization, really. When you think about it, I think in the most pure form, Extinction Rebellion would have cities torn down because that's human development. There's no question about it. Like I made in my recent video, the world's megacities face severe problems. But what you have to do is look for answers within the context of the problem, not try to seek these utopian solutions that will not happen. They won't happen. Um, Unless you absolutely put a halt to human civilization. We have to do something. We have to take the problem seriously. But one thing that frustrates me about them is I think they are actually distracting people from the real issue, which is climate change. I do not agree with those conservatives who say it's all a myth. I think that they're head in the sand. I mean, we've seen it this year. There's always been climatic change in the Earth's history. Human beings, or let's say Homo sapiens, have occupied Earth for what, a million years, perhaps 2 million at most. The Earth's about 4.5 billion years old. There's always been cyclical change, but what has happened is it's become more regular. And whilst individual storms, for example, don't necessarily point to human influenced climate change, I think what we are seeing is more regularity. Um, and definitely rising temperatures. I think there's empirical evidence for that. So we can't ignore the problem. Like I mentioned at the start of the video, issues like plastic waste need to be taken very seriously. Um, but let's say even if the British government done exactly what Extinction Rebellion wants, which won't happen, they'll never be satisfied. Let's say that was the case. Well, in world terms, we're a relatively low carbon emitter. What are they going to do about India and China and the United States? Which those three countries combined, probably, I don't want to put a figure on it, but they are responsible for the vast majority of carbon emissions in the world. Are they going to tell the Indians and Chinese to shut all their factories? To ban all their cars? They're both developing economies. That's not going to happen. So I'm using Extinction Rebellion as an example, but I can expand this to other protest movements. Any protest movement that polarizes the public, it's not going to work. It's like earlier in the year when that young woman was murdered in London, Sarah Everard, and I don't want to sound like I'm sort of jumping on her case as an example, but again, protesters polarized people because they said men need to step up. Earlier, I was reading a report about two men who were hospitalized because they actually did step up and they intervened. They saw a woman being raped, and the assailant, I don't know if he had a weapon. I was skimming through the report, but they were hurt. So, this notion that men don't step up is absurd. I think the vast majority of men, if they saw a woman being raped, would do something. Whether it was physically confronting the assailant, whether it was, contacting the police, something. That's an example of the sort of hyperbole that's used in protest movements. And I do think that some feminists hijacked that just to basically have a go at men. And they were scaremongering because the chances of a woman being killed in Britain are actually extremely low. That's a fact. That's not to say there isn't a problem, but I do think, I mean, London, for example, it's a city of 9 million people. Uh, One woman tragically loses her life. It's an evil crime, you know. But I think they were scaremongering. Um, and there's other examples. Black Lives Matter. Well, I've made my position on that clear. I think again they started off with legitimate concerns about police brutality, but they've basically just become, in many ways, an anti-white organization. I mean, they polarize white people who would otherwise be supportive with their damaging rhetoric. It just and they can't grasp how polarizing that is when they talk about trying to combat whiteness and tear down statues because of neo-colonialism. They've went well beyond what they were initially about, which was tackling police brutality. And if they'd stuck to that, I think they'd have more support. Um, Even a movement which I'm very personally sympathetic to, the Hong Kong students. Most of them are students, there's other people as well. I despise the Chinese Communist Party, and the CCP did betray the Sino-British Joint Declaration. Hong Kongers, particularly young Hong Kongers, have absolutely every right to be worried about the future. So I support the movement 100%. But even in that movement, there were examples of people doing stupid things, like vandalizing shops belonging to mainland Chinese people. That's just stupid. That just looks like what it is, criminal behavior. It's, that isn't going to make mainland Chinese feel sympathetic. It's just going to make them feel resentful. And then they will back the CCP's excuses. Oh, well, we need to be more draconian to control these riots. Of course, in the beginning, the protests were genuinely peaceful. There was no vandalism, and it had huge support, up to 2 million people in a city of 7 million, so a major proportion of that city. But I think over time, as the CCP got more totalitarian, some of the protests kind of splintered off and became more extreme, and there was violence, no question about it. Um, some really bad things happened. So, in terms of Hong Kong, I would say to those protesters, I'm with you ideologically, 100%, but don't be stupid. Don't vandalize shops. Don't hold up the whole city and polarize people in that way. Um, so for me, I'll draw a conclusion here. It's not about the issue at hand. It's not about whether it be climate change, human rights, women's rights as part of that, Black Lives Matter, you name it. Um, Standing up to totalitarianism. In most of those cases, I'm sympathetic to the ideology. In fact, pretty much in all those cases. But I cannot support people who cannot understand that their tactics are backfiring, who are deliberately polarizing the public. I just can't. And most people won't. It's not that most people are selfish. It's not that most people don't care. It's that most people do not have the luxury of being revolutionaries. Now, in some parts of the world, there may be no choice in this because you have totalitarian regimes that really, really are stripping back rights. And I'm talking about real totalitarian moves, not what they are calling the policing bill in this country. There's no comparison. There just isn't. And sometimes protests in the world, I was looking last night at the protests earlier this year in Colombia. Now, there probably was some violence from protesters and vandalism, but there was absolutely police brutality as well. Even the president had to acknowledge that. I mean, dozens of people were killed. This is the worst violence Colombia has seen in years. Um, in Bogota and other cities, so that was very troubling. Seeing what was happening, it was more like the scenes from Venezuela a few years ago. So that sort of situation, you do have police brutality. It's a major, major problem in many parts of the world, and that breeds anger and resentment at the governments in question. So I firmly believe in people's right to express dissent anywhere. even on issues I don't agree with. You know, I'm not saying, oh, well, they could protest if I agree with the issue. I might disagree with the issue, but it's, I don't have a right to say they can't protest. But as a citizen, I'm saying that if you polarize the public, that's it. It's counterproductive. You will not win. You will lose. If you get the public on side, that's the way people power happens. Not by polarizing the public, by getting the public on side. And I don't think Extinction Rebellion really want to do that because they see themselves as revolutionaries. So they kind of have this privileged little sense of self-righteousness. I don't think Extinction Rebellion actually want the majority on their side. I think they get a kick out of being the minority. But anyway, those are some things to think about. The right to peaceful protest. By peaceful, I'm talking about peaceful. I'm not talking about throwing Molotov cocktails at police. I'm not talking about vandalism. I'm talking about peaceful protest. That is a right. But as soon as you start polarizing the public, as soon as you start hurting the public, perhaps more specifically, and as soon as you start engaging in criminal behavior, then you may not lose the ideological argument, but you certainly don't help to advance that ideological argument. So that's something to think about.